So I'm Andre Stitt, artist. My family comes from Donegal Pass in Belfast. So I spent part of my childhood in Donegal Pass, and then we moved out up the Lisburn Road to Seymour Hill. Went to school in Seymour Hill. Always knew that I wanted to be an artist, always. And so as soon as I finished secondary school, I went to art school here just around the corner from GT Gallery at Belfast College of Art, as it was then, and did my degree there. When I finished that, I then moved to London and got involved in squatting in London, the art scene at a kind of alternative level, if you like. Lived there until 1999. Then moved to Cardiff, where I took up a position as head of time-based practice, which was an experimental art department in Cardiff School of Art and Design. Became a professor at the University of Wales in 2004. Now we find ourselves back in Belfast for this exhibition, which is a kind of a retrospective centering on my performance art activity over the years. But rather than it focusing on documentation, say through photography or video, which is often the only way that performance art is evidenced after the fact, what I've done is to really look at the collection of artifacts that I just kept for myself as much as anything in my studios over the years. And so there'd be objects or what you might call residues from performances, things used in performances, maybe things used in several performances, like an axe, for instance, or a bar of soap, like this. So, for instance, this is, I think the last time this was used was sometime in the 1990s. This was used in an action whereby I had a bath, and I was using the bath as a metaphor for the body and cleansing the bath with this bar of soap. So I was scrubbing and cleansing the enamel in the bath. And for me that had kind of socio-political overtones and related back to my experiences during the Troubles of the body, or the body being traumatized and cleansed in some way, ultimately. So many of the objects that we're placing here on these shelving units, I wanted something that was almost anthropological in a sense, museum-like, but was also open. So it wasn't something that you would have in glass cases. So you had a relationship, your own body had a relationship to these materials. It wasn't kind of cut off or separated from them. So when you're up close to some of the materials, you can start to have a kind of the odor of maybe materials that were used with, say, some of these things like, here's an old shirt that was worn in a performance and it's got some blood on it. There's some old feathers which had oil in them. There's actually a copper. In this performance, I took the shirt off and I nailed it to a post, and there's still the old copper nail in it. As you can see, it's just turned green the way the copper does. So these materials have a kind of life of their own, in the same way that making the live performance was very much a live activity and very much about living art as it happened. So I didn't want to make this show whereby you would have this direct evidence where you could actually see me doing something. I wanted, and I do want people to kind of create their own narrative out of what they see, so that they create a kind of narrative out of, by association, in relation to their own personal history, not my history, but also relating to perhaps a common history. And a lot of the work, although it's taken place in different countries over the years, throughout the world, I've made work all over the world, it does always seem to be anchored back in my formative experience in Northern Ireland, and it always relates back to that in some way. And I'm interested in how my experience might reflect in relation to an experience of someone else in another country and their own identity. It might be a colonial identity or a post-colonial identity or a traumatic incident that might have happened in their own lives. So I'll just grab the tea here. Always good to have a cup of tea when you're talking about art. Then if you follow me through here, we're just putting these on the wall at the moment. During the 1990s until the present, each, as a way of signaturing performances as they happen, I would wear these dog tags. So we have a whole collection of dog tags. On each dog tag, for instance, here we have, let's see if we can see this. Here we say, can you pick that up? It says Action, New York, 1999. And then on this one, that's the title of the performance. It's called Witness. So I would have these as a kind of signature and a title within the performance, but I would be wearing them. So what you have then are dog tags that are then stained with whatever happened in the performance. See, I can actually see a bit of kind of blood impregnated into some of these as well. In this gallery, what we've done is to look at some recent elements in performances. Recently, from about 2005 onwards, I started making big installation work in which performances could happen in major galleries, like Baltic and Gateshead, for instance. And these would be big fabricated wall structures. Within these structures, there would be materials for performances, but placed in archive boxes. The performances would be 4 weeks long. I'd be working in the gallery every day, and I'd be taking materials out of the boxes and then working on the installation structure itself. So we've actually tried to collect material from those performances and installation, but we've actually kept them in the boxes. So it's a kind of like, well, what are these materials? What were they used for? But what you can actually see is leakage as well from some of the elements that are in these boxes. For instance, these were like little pants and vests used in performances, and they're covered in tar and bitumen. I used tar and bitumen and feathers to kind of locate a certain kind of situation that came out of Northern Ireland for punishment, tarring and feathering. So there's a kind of relationship there. So we try to include some elements that have been left from performances. Then back here, I've included some early work from 1980. And I made a series of performances investigating, locating, inquiring, trying to understand the relationship of the Schenkel butchers to sectarian violence, and particularly men working in groups and male violence within the community. These were replicas of Schenkel, the knives used by the Schenkel butcher gang, but they were replicas. I then made another replica via photocopying the knives on a photocopying machine, and then I got rid of the knives. So it's a kind of like a kind of distancing from the event, but holding on to the evidence of the event. There's a kind of forensic inquiry taking place about what these things might mean. So I've included some of these. These have never been exhibited before, and I found these old photocopies in a folder. This is a sign I picked up from a performance I made in 1997 in New York. And I walked up and down Broadway for several days with this sign, "God is sexy," talking to the American public on the streets about how sexy God was. That's really all there was to it, but it was quite a kind of an interesting performance in terms of sometimes arguments that would take place. Certain people call me a blasphemer, for instance, but also a lot of people seeing a kind of a certain amount of humor in it, you know. And this sign was actually in the backyard of a friend who lived down in Prince Street in Soho in New York, and it was there from 1997 until this show. So she's actually posted this over especially for the show. God is sexy. I think God is sexy no matter what people say.